On today's podcast, we'll be talking about family meals and the division of responsibility with our guest, Ellyn Satter. Welcome to Feeding the Family with Dr. Kristen, where we help you navigate the challenges of feeding your family and learn about the role food plays in our health and relationships. Feeding and food relationships can be stressful, confusing, and even destructive. I'm Kristen Saxena, a pediatrician and mother of 4 who's been researching and sharing what I've learned about feeding for over 10 years. In this podcast, I'll share my experience and expertise to help our kids and ourselves with everyday survival tips for real parents. This podcast is about progress, not perfection. So let's get started. Welcome back to Feeding the Family with Dr. Kristen. I'm your host, Kristen Saxena. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about family meals and the division of responsibility in feeding. I'm very excited about our guest today, as she is the author of The Division of Responsibility. Ellyn Satter is a world-renowned specialist and authority on feeding children. She's the author of several books on the subject, and actually one of the people whose information and teachings got me very interested in this subject in the first place. Thanks for joining us, Ellyn.
Well, it's just a pleasure, Kristen. It's good to see you.
You too. So I think I've told this story before on our show, but I want to relate to everyone how I first came to be familiar with you, Ellyn Satter, and the amazing work you do. So I will recall, there's not a lot of people I recall the first time I heard about them, but I definitely remember the day, place I was when I first heard about you and your work. No pressure.
I feel honored. Wow, to have that kind of niche in your mind.
It's true. So I was in my second year of my pediatric residency. We do, they would host these kind of lunch and learns for all of the residents. And, you know, you'd go there, just get some free lunch and sit down for a minute. And this particular day, they had a woman who, we were in Minnesota, and she was a family practice doctor, but she was running a company where she kind of helped families who were having feeding problems with their children. And she really introduced a lot of the things that I'm hoping to talk with you about on our show today, but these concepts of focusing on feeding dynamics within a family and with your child, and ideas such as structure, the importance of family meals, and really this division of responsibility, which is really your brainchild. And I just remember it hit me at such a important, sometimes the right information just comes to you at the very right time. So I'm in the second year of my pediatric residency, where we're doing, seeing kids in the hospital, but also doing clinic. And in clinic, as you know, because you are a dietitian and therapist, but in clinic, nearly every family that you encounter has some question or concern about the way their child is eating. It was almost universal. And at the same time, at the very beginning of my second year of residency, I also had my first child. So I was also embarking in this adventure of feeding my own child. And I was at this crux because I think before I had my own child, I felt like, I'm a doctor, I have all this training, I know exactly what your child's supposed to be eating, how they're supposed to be doing it, why can't you just do this? Then I get a real child that I'm responsible for, and it's like, how is anyone supposed to do this? These kind of recommendations of what you should be doing, what you should be eating, they don't work. They don't translate to real life. And it's very stressful as a parent. So it just hit me, and I was like, this is genius. I need to know more. And from that point on, since like 2009, I've secretly been fangirl of Ellyn Satter.
That's great. And so, yes, and we have had associations over the years and worked on some projects. I've taken an interest in you and your work. But, it's that's your story is quite healing for me, because one of the things I did last year that I didn't feel really great about was I gave a lecture to about 80 really exhausted pediatric residents somewhere in California. And I just felt like what I had to say just dropped like a bomb, because the poor guys, the poor people, they listened to the lecture and there were no questions. It was kind of like dropping it into a deep well. And I was left wondering, well, these poor people, were they too tired to hear anything?
Yes. The answer to that is probably yes. I would not take that personally. Because I would say too, I've spoken since with other people from my residency group, and they also, we all remembered, people are familiar with, the Satter feeding dynamics model, division of responsibility. And honestly, I relate that all. I'm not sure that they would know that if we didn't have that opportunity. So yes, no, maybe it didn't feel like it at the moment, but my guess, I would find it hard to believe that you didn't very positively influence some of those young doctors at that time.
Well, you always hope for at least one person who resonates your message. So you give me hope.
Well, know that in the world there was at least one. But that's what I'm most excited to have you talk about. So 2 of the things that you're most well known for are what's known as the Satter feeding dynamics model and Satter eating competence model. So probably they kind of feed into each other. Haha, no pun intended. But but probably what's most relevant to our listeners, who are mostly parents, would be your feeding dynamics model. Can you please walk us through what that is and why it's important?
Well, you talked about hearing in your residency about the Satter division of responsibility in feeding. And by the way, I put my name on everything because I want to protect it. There's always somebody who comes along who has a better idea, and then they spoil what I intended in the first place. So the division of responsibility says that for children who are toddlers and older, kids who've grown up to the family table, that parents are responsible for the what, when, and where of feeding, and that children are responsible for the how much and whether of eating. And that, which, probably as a young parent, both encouraged you about knowing what it was that you had to do, and also lightened up your chores, because there are certain things that you just have no control over, and you really don't have to try to make them happen. And so, yes, the division of responsibility has been very free. And the thing is, it's out there. That people know about it. Some of the major agencies, professional practice groups, they cite the division of responsibility. But unfortunately, they cite it and they spoil it. The American Dietetic Association parrots it, and then they say, and it has to be healthy food. It has to be low-fat food. And the American Academy of Pediatrics parrots it, and it says, your child can't be above the 95th percentile or even the 85th percentile. So there's always someone wandering in and sort of spoiling it. Practitioners will say, do the division of responsibility and don't worry if your child eats or not. And, sooner or later he's going to get hungry and he's going to eat. But, some children, for whatever reason, have a lot of trouble eating. They might have, really sensitive to taste or textures. They might react strongly to unfamiliar food, or they might have a history of food struggles with their parents. That the parents have been concerned from little on about their eating and have quite naturally gotten kind of pushy about it, whereupon the child reacts, and you get into this kind of a relationship. Are they going to see me on video, or do I need to explain what I'm doing when I do that? Do I need to say?
There is video, yeah, but
there is video.
It'll be both audio and video.
Okay. So when they're butting heads anyway. And so, there are nuances that go along with the division of responsibility that are really important. For instance, a a critical nuance is, how do you go about planning a family meal so everybody can be successful with the meal? Not only the children, but the grown-ups who don't exactly like everything that's put before them, or the poor cook who feels like she has to please everybody with every dinner every night. And so how do you navigate that? Mm-hmm. And I like to talk about being considerate without catering with meal planning.
Yes,
which
we
means
use the line at home, not every meal's going to be your favorite. That's what because I have 4 kids, and so that's always my line is.
That's good for you. Well, let me edit that a bit, Kristen, because I would say not every food at every meal is going to be your favorite, but there's always going to be something that you generally eat. Mm-hmm. So if all else fails, there's butter, or there's bread, there's rice, there's canned peaches, there's going to be something on the table that you can eat. And so then when you plan your meals, being considerate means that those 1 or 2, my readers on Facebook, when they're not mad at me, call those safe foods. And they talk about how their children need to see these foods that make them feel safe when they come to the table. Along with the unfamiliar foods, you as the parent are entitled to plan menus around what you like and what you eat and what you feel good cooking. Yeah. And your kids are growing up to learn to eat those foods. And so that really provides the backbone for the meals. But then there also has to be something there that makes them feel safe, even if it represents some pretty weird menu planning. It needs to be there.
So one question I have is, when I first learned about it and when you kind of hear about it, it sounds very simple, very straightforward. But at the same time, it seems to be counter to the way a lot of us naturally approach feeding kids, and maybe the way that a lot of us were fed growing up. So not necessarily the way it ends up being done most of the time. So a question I have is, how did you even come up with this? And how did you figure out that it worked?
Well, I came up with it one time when my back was to the wall in a counseling session. I worked as an outpatient dietitian in a group medical practice for about the first 15 years of my career. And then I went back to school and became a psychotherapist. So I kind of worked at it from both ends, a family therapist. But I was in a counseling session with this mom and her 8-year-old son. And it was sort of back in the days when we had satellite clinics and hard copy records. And so the record hadn't arrived. So the only thing I had on these 2 was weight issues. And the kid was, kind of chubby, and I was trying to work my way out of telling parents what their kids should eat, although I hadn't quite gotten all the way out. And so I was sort of hammering away about having meals and having protein and milk and bread. And she said, "Oh, we're already doing that. We're doing that." And I said, "All right, well, that's good." And then I'd had some other suggestion that I made, and she was getting madder and madder, and the kid was just sliding down in his chair. Poor little sweetie, he just looked miserable. And I'm doing that, and finally she said, "You haven't told me anything I don't already know. And look at him. He's too fat, and his brother at home is too thin. And what am I supposed to do? How am I going to get him to eat less and the other one to eat more?" And I thought, holy smoke, she's got me there. What goes through your head? And so I said, well, I don't think it's your job to get him, and I called him by name, to eat less, and his brother to eat more. I think you're doing your job. You're getting the food on the table. You are seeing to it that they get regular meals and snacks, and then after that, it's up to them how much they eat and how they grow. Oh, she was madder than ever. She didn't like it. And I thought, holy smokes, can that be right? And the little boy sat up and started to smile. You can always tell by how a kid reacts if you're on the right track. Mm-hmm. And he was like transformed. He finally heard something that sounded okay to him. Mm-hmm. And so I let it stand. It was the only worthwhile thing I'd said all day. So, and then I started thinking about it, and I thought, is this true? I mean, can we really do that? Is that right? It sounds pretty daring. And then, I tested it out, and then I got started reading some of the literature, and sure enough, the research literature supported it. So it's some of my best insights I've blundered into. You're under stress, and suddenly your mind starts to work in a different way. And so, I remember, talk about moments you remember.
Right? Well, so you have this sort of like aha moment a little bit in your clinic with this family, and yes, you start to kind of read about it and reinforce this idea, maybe start having success with other families that you're working with. But then you've gone on to do like a whole slew of your own sort of studies and research to validate this. Can you tell us a little bit about what that entails and what you've found for families that follow the division of responsibility?
By all means. Yes. And over the years, I've accumulated a lot of data from research that other people have done that supports the model, supports the intervention, the division of responsibility in feeding. And then starting about 10 years ago, in fact, it was around 2010, that we started testing an inventory, a paper and pencil inventory, to assess whether or not parents are following the division of responsibility in feeding. And this was a long and agonizing process that, unless you beg me, I won't tell you about. But it just took so long because it was so excruciatingly difficult to get at questions to ask them that really captured what they were doing and to capture a shared understanding. And it's interactive. I mean, when I did the eating competence inventory, it was easy. I developed it in my practice. We tested it. It was pretty good. And it was just really easy because it was one person in relationship to the food. But with SDOR, it's two people in relationship to each other and the food. So it's so interactive, so hard to get at the items. And then we tested it. We had people fill out the questionnaire, and then we videoed them to see if they were really doing what they said they were doing on the questionnaire. And then we finally validated it against a bunch of other questionnaires. And what we ended up with actually works. It actually determines whether parents are following the division of responsibility. And we do find that when they do, children have lower nutritional risk. Not a word about food, not a word about what they eat, but that children have lower nutritional.
And can you define for somebody that maybe doesn't understand what do you mean lower nutritional risk?
Well, it means that children have a pretty good chance of eating a nutritionally adequate diet. Mm-hmm. That if you attend to the mechanics of getting a meal on the table and, being trusting and accepting with your child that he will sooner or later get around to eating what you provide, he's going to have a pretty good diet, even though on any one day it's not going to look all that impressive.
And what were the specific kind of outcomes that you guys measured then, saying, okay, so for people that follow the division of responsibility, here's what we're finding are more or less likely in those children in terms of outcomes?
Well, you see, we haven't gotten there yet. Now we have the tool, and so we have the test, and so now we can start giving SDOR 2 to 6 years to big populations of parents and children and seeing, okay, when parents follow SDOR, what happens with growth? Do children tend to grow consistently, or do they get too fat, or do they get too thin? We're thinking that they're going to grow great, but we haven't really tested that. Our clinical experience supports that. But until you really do a research trial, you can't be sure that what you think is happening is really happening. We have good grounding for a nutritionally adequate diet, but we could do SDOR in WIC and find out if parents who feed following SDOR have children who have a lower likelihood of having iron deficiency anemia. Mm-hmm. And so, now we're ready to start asking the questions.
And do you do measures? Oh, sorry, but do you do measures of like variety within the diet, or?
Sure, that's one of the outcomes that we can measure. But, and that's part of nutritional risk. And when you say a child's nutritional status is good, that means that child is eating a variety of food and getting the different fruits and vegetables and milk and meat or protein foods and grains that he needs. And so it means that we know already that children are doing pretty well nutritionally. And we know something about the parents too, and that is when the parents follow a division of responsibility in feeding, that they're more likely to be eating competent, that they're doing a better, for the most part, they're feeling positive and relaxed and are good about feeding themselves faithfully. They have regular meals with food they enjoy, and they let themselves eat as much as they enjoy eating.
Yeah, I thought that was what was interesting, and we can talk about that a little bit more too. But one of the things was that not only did it make the feeding experience, if you will, or eating experience better for the child, but it also, as part of this dynamic, even made it a better experience for the parent.
Absolutely. Well, yes. And I'm impressed. You seem like you're reading the literature. Good for you.
Well, once in a while I get into this stuff.
Well, it's great. I like these kinds of conversations. And yes, if you recall, the parents who scored high on SDOR and were eating competent had lower stress overall. They slept better. And they tended to have, and the parents who were, the context part, their ability to plan, to have regular meals correlated with their psychosocial indicators overall. I mean, their high esteem, their self-esteem was better, their anxiety was lower, they just felt better overall,
And as a parent, isn't that all you're looking for? You're like, I just want to be able to relax, maybe sleep well, feel happy. Yeah. And this is it. You figured it out.
Yeah, just let me tell you how to eat and your life will be fine.
That's right.
But of course, we can't even say that in today's world because it gets spoiled. Because what it gets turned to, we've been hammered on for so long about eating. You have to eat the right food and you have to eat the right amounts and you can't eat fat and you can't eat this and that. And what did I say just a minute ago? Let me help you with your eating. Your life will turn out fine. Well, most people transpose that into eat your fruits and vegetables and, drink skim milk. And so it's you have to be really careful about the messages you use and how people decode the message, because when you talk about food, almost anything you say sort of goes down as a scolding on the other end, and that's not what I want. I want people to be freed up, to be joyful and rewarded and feel confident with eating and feeding.
Well, related to that, and forgive me if I get the quote or the way that you generally say it a little off, but what I always think about when I think about your model and sort of your whole philosophy is that the how of feeding is much more important than the what. And the great part is like you said, I think a lot of us come in with our concern being at the what. Like they're eating too much of this, not enough of this. What should we be feeding? And we're guilty with that through, the media and society, and also within, the medical community, a lot of the dietitian community. That is often the focus. But what you've said, the how is more important than the what. But ironically or wonderfully, the what seems to improve naturally when you figure out the how. So can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, yes, you're quite right. The how really brings the what along. There's no two ways about it. Well, let's talk about adults in relationship to their eating. Yesterday, I gave a lecture about eating competence in context. And so just let me circle back a little bit and tell you what eating competence is. And it's adults in relationship to their own eating. And people are eating competent when they feel good about eating, their attitudes are positive, that they take an interest in food, and are inclined to experiment with unfamiliar food, which means they increase their variety over time, but that they don't have to. They eat as much as they're hungry for. They depend on their hunger and appetite satiety to guide how much they eat. And did I say they have regular meals and snacks? I did. Okay, so that's 4. And of course, it's the context kind of holds the whole thing up. And so adults say we have a grown-up who comes in to see us and they say, oh man, my eating is just a mess. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to eat. I try to eat fruits and I feel so bad. So you recognize it all.
Yep.
It's just, and so how to get started. And then I have a handout that I call The Joy of Eating. And it has 3 points on it, 1 page. And it says, feed yourself faithfully. Have meals and snacks made up of food you generally eat, food you enjoy, food that you can reliably get on the table, be good to yourself with food. So feed yourself faithfully. Give yourself permission to eat. You can eat, and that's strong permission, unflinching permission. It's like, eat as much as you're hungry for, eat the food you enjoy, eat until you feel satisfied. Don't eat it if it doesn't taste good to you, And so you pair the two. And so people, if all goes well, people say, well, I can do that. And they go out and they have their meals and they say, well, instead of just throwing the pizza on the counter and having everybody come and get it when they get around to it, why don't we all sit down together and eat the pizza? And what should we have with it? Well, nothing, or maybe a can of peaches, or, so you have the structure. Feed yourself faithfully. Feed your family faithfully.
You mean like with a structure on like a regular, on like a regular time frame.
But I'm real deliberate in my language, because if I say structure, they'll think
rigid, right?
Deer in the headlights. Yeah. And if I say discipline, they're going to say, and it really is discipline because you're getting the meal on. But if you say discipline, people are going to think negative discipline, and that takes all the fun out of it. Yeah. So feed yourself faithfully, give yourself permission to eat, and that is strong permission to eat. That it's all right to eat that and that and that and that. I just need to pay attention.
So, as you describe this, I have to ask the question, what percentage of adults in real life would actually be considered eating competent? Because it doesn't seem like what I'm used to, seeing within the community of people that I hang around with. And is this something that exists mostly on a spectrum? Yeah. Am I pretty eating competent, very eating competent?
Well, we have the eating competence inventory. And I clinically, I came up with the cutoff being about 32. So above you're competent, below you're not. It's kind of arbitrary, and it really is a continuum. But actually, about half of the people are eating competent.
That's pretty good, because what I think of is, and we've probably talked about this and we talk about it on our show a lot, is that a lot of the struggles we have with feeding our kids, adhering to things like the division of responsibility, a lot of it stems from our anxiety as parents, like our own anxiety about food, and maybe our own lack of eating competence, I would think.
I agree.
So then that kind of, to me, begs the question, if as I'm hearing all of these things, or I always say this, and I'm hearing all these things. You're telling me, in order to be good at this feeding dynamics and division of responsibility, I have to be myself a competent eater. Great. Like, now I have to fix me too. I was just trying to get my kid to eat more than 5 foods, right? So you're like, ugh. So what do you do? What advice do you give to parents that are hearing this and they're thinking, okay, I don't know that I'm the most eating competent person hearing this description, but it seems very stressful to have to wait until I fix myself to think that I'll be able to be good at feeding my family.
Well, once in a while, that is the case. If people, keeping in mind that half of people test competent with their eating, which I find rather surprising too, because all you hear is people moaning and groaning about their food. And so it seems a little contradictory. But I like to think about it from the other way around. So say a parent comes in and says, my child is just such a picky eater. Mm-hmm. He'll only eat 2 or 3 foods.
Yeah, which I hear so often, right? I mean, that's like one of the most common concerns of parents is just this short list of foods that their child seems to willingly eat.
Right. Well, and a lot depends on the age of the child, because if you have a toddler, it's absolutely normal for them to be a picky eater. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's abnormal when they're not. And once in a while you have a toddler, he'll eat almost everything, but most generally they don't. And if the parent gets started catering to that kid, short order cooking or pressuring that child to eat, then chances are by the time the child is preschooler, he's going to have an even shorter list of foods that he eats. So it starts out normal kid behavior, and if the parents become over responsible at trying to address it, then it gets worse. And so really the solution is to have a division of responsibility in feeding, and to be considerate without catering with meal planning, and to lighten up on the kid and don't put pressure on him or try to trick or reward or coerce or persuade him in any way to eat, not even to do elaborate modeling.
Yeah, well, because I always think too, as you say that, a lot of that comes from this anxiety. And I always tell parents that comes from a place of love. And this is my own kind of made up theory, but I always think of everything in terms of like cavemen, right? And so if you were a caveman and you saw your little cave baby not eating when the food was available, that would be very stressful to you, because there wasn't, a grocery store down the street. You couldn't get Walmart to deliver you something. Now we have food everywhere. But at the time it would be like, you need to eat this boar we've caught because I don't know when we're going to eat next, right? So I feel like there's something in our caveman brain that comes from a place of love and caring. And so you want to figure out what I need to do to put food into this child. But that's not the world that we live in. Instead, you have to kind of think of the long play. So we end up, the things you see, like you said, parents become short order cooks because they just want their child to eat. I see a lot of people that really think of milk as this, especially for younger kids. Well, at least they'll drink their milk. So then that kid's drinking, a gallon of milk every 2 days and not eating anything else. And that comes with its own health problems. Or we see the coercive type behaviors, or nowadays, I think the one I'll see a lot is kids, eating parked in front of like an iPad, kind of with this distracted, if you don't pay attention, I'll be able to kind of shovel some extra bites into your mouth. Yeah. And I think it's easy to, when you really sit down and think about it, think of how these are sort of reinforcing things that are negative. And then as adults are all the things we think we're trying to correct about ourselves in terms of, mindless eating and, eating beyond when we're hungry or full, all of those things. It's easy if you really sit and think about it, how we're creating those behaviors. But I think it comes from a place of parental anxiety, but a place really, like I like to say, don't feel bad about it, because I think ultimately it comes from this like inherent love and care you have for your child. You have to be able to think beyond today's dinner and say, what behaviors are we creating and reinforcing?
Exactly.
In the future.
Which brings us back, your original question was about eating competence. And what we're discussing is how the parents' eating competence impinges on this whole process of bringing a child back from being such a, at the extreme of being a picky eater. And so the child then, you give the recommendation, division of responsibility, regular family meals. And so then at this point, then the parent starts to ask the very questions you're talking about, Kristen, which is, oh my goodness, does this mean I have to have a broiled chicken breast and broccoli, and I have to put meals on the table, and what am I supposed to have at mealtime? So you start to impinge on the sort of the parents' negatives, their anxiety about what they're having, their anxiety about whether they're eating a variety of food. Once in a while, you get a parent who's pretty picky, who's been bullied by his parent about eating more vegetables than he really is. And so as you go along, you sort of address those things with the parent. And, there was a nice study, you talk about Minneapolis, it came out of the Diane Newmark-Steiner's laboratory in St. Paul, University of Minnesota, where they did focus interviews with parents of, single parents, two-parent families, and so on, and found out what it was that the families were doing for meals and what their patterns were, what the barriers were. And one of the barriers was a child who was picky, not surprising. But the point that I wanted to make about that study is that it was consistent pattern that when, with respect to family meals, that when parents made a healthy meal, whatever that is, healthy, home cooked, they sat down together and ate it. But if they happened to have a meal they brought in from the fast food restaurant, or they home delivered, or some food that they didn't consider healthy, everybody went off and ate on their own. So the attitude was the only food that you worthy of being dignified with the mealtime ritual was healthy, home cooked. Well, is that or is that not a pretty undermining attitude?
Right. Well, do you think that was just because the cook was like, what? I made this. You're going to sit down with me and eat it? Or, or is it just a sense of casual? Yeah.
Well, it's all or nothing attitude. If we're going to have a meal and it's going to be so nice, then we're going to have healthy home cooked food. That requires getting wrapped up to a pretty high energy level to pull all that off.
Yeah.
Whereas if the cook says, well, we're going to have pizza tonight, let's set the table, get the pizza in the middle of the table, and that's a meal.
Yeah.
And everybody can sit down and enjoy that together. In fact, my definition of a meal is when everybody sits down together and shares the same food.
I love it.
Period.
Yeah.
That's it.
I love that. And I think that, number one, I love what you said about this all or nothing mentality. And I think that's something that a lot of parents get trapped in, where you feel like, well, if I can't do this 100% wonderfully, it's just not for me. This doesn't work for us. And this is not that. And that's not the kind of philosophy you carry. And that's not the kind of ideas that to promote. And really, it's all about meeting you where you are and finding out what works for your family and sort of incrementally building on successes, I would say. So I want to talk about specifically...
Wait.
Sorry.
Wait. We haven't talked about the parents failing to like vegetables, because this is, now we have the child coming to the table. Parent has lightened up about what has to be on the table, but vegetables, what are we going to do about the vegetables? So the parent doesn't like vegetables. They don't enjoy vegetables. So how are they going to get their kid to eat vegetables if they don't enjoy vegetables? Well, they're not. But they are going to raise a child who is not phobic about vegetables. There might be one or two vegetables that shows up on the table. The parent eats it and enjoys it. And children do tend to eat vegetables that their parents enjoy. Enjoy, not eat, not fake it and eat, but enjoy. And so, but if the child then feeling sort of neutral about vegetables, goes out into the world, he's going to be introduced to vegetables by other people who enjoy them. And over time, he'll learn to like them.
Do you suggest to put those it is harder for me to relate to because I love food, and that's part of the other reason that I'm a person who likes a good variety, and so it's not something I think about a lot in terms of that's not something that comes into my mind a lot, but I love that point. And so if you are a person who kind of grew up and now are I'm not a person that likes a lot of vegetables, but my wish for my child is to be less picky than I am, and so do you suggest that they sort of introduce some foods that they themselves may not, it's a side dish. So I think, as you say, it's all about putting it on the table. You decide what we're going to eat, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of us have to eat every component of the meal. So let's just say, I just don't like vegetables, but maybe making it as a side dish because perhaps the rest of my family will enjoy it. And just because I don't like it doesn't mean it can't be on the table.
So the question is, if I don't like vegetables and I'm the cook, how are vegetables going to find their way onto my table? And so maybe part of being considerate without catering is I make vegetables for the other people in the family. I might have the non-cook part of the partnership might enjoy vegetables. Or, kids learn about vegetables in school and they come home and they say, hey, let's try broccoli. And you think, oh my God, broccoli. and so what's the parent to do? Well, you say, well, I really haven't enjoyed broccoli in the past, but by golly, if you're interested in it, let's get some and let's see about cooking it, and I'll sure try it with you. And so let's see what we find out about broccoli. And so, the parent really doesn't have to fake it in order to bring their child along. They just need to preserve attitudes. Now, one more point, and then I'll let you go on to what it was that you wanted to raise, and that is how much. Division of responsibility, how much the child needs. And we have a child who's, whose health care provider has read the riot act with the parent because the child's too fat and the child's not supposed to eat too much and, not supposed to have, certainly not ice cream. But then division of responsibility in feeding says have a variety of food, be considerate without catering, and include high-fat, high-sugar food often enough so it wears out their specialness.
Like it doesn't become a forbidden food or...
Exactly. So here's the parent, a dieter.
Look at that. If anybody that's watching the videos just saw that judgy face.
Yeah. And so the parent is a dieter, and they're really restrictive with their own eating. And so here they do a division of responsibility, let the child eat as much as they want. And so at first, the child eats like there's no tomorrow. And, and if the parent can keep their nerve, over time, that's going to settle down. But even then, here's the parent who has no sense of their own internal ability to internally regulate their own food intake, trying to do for their child what they can't do for themselves. And so that's kind of where the rubber hits the road with the eating competence. I mean, that's the big challenge for parents is when they don't internally regulate, being able to be trusting, accepting with their child's ability to internally regulate because they simply don't have any frame of reference.
Yeah, I think that was a key word you said was trust. And I think you've said that before. And it can be, even knowing all of this, there's something that it's still sometimes difficult on the day to day, just as your automatic response. Sometimes I think it's difficult to have that trust. But, I think through your work and what you've found, it's that trust that allows that child to maintain that, sort of intuitive nature, or regain and then maintain that intuitive nature in terms of how much they really need to eat, how much their body needs to eat at the time, and, what food it needs. Because, I really do think, I think that's something that kids and babies, they're sort of born with this drive, and research would show that, if left alone, I think you kind of talked about this too, kids will eat a variety of food over time, not necessarily in one day. It may look like today all we ate was goldfish crackers. I feel like that's all you eat. But sort of left to their own devices, they will generally naturally or they will change how much they eat based on their activity level and their growth at the time. And they will eat a variety of foods self-selected if sort of left alone to do that.
Self-selected within the context of the food that the parent is making available to them. So they're not going to eat only and all goldfish because the parent isn't offering them all the time. And so, and if the child, it sort of brings us back to starving the child into submission. I started that thread earlier and we got off to something else. And I said, no, you're not going to do division of responsibility and starve the child into submission because you're going to be considerate without catering with your menu planning. So even the extraordinarily picky child, bordering on food phobic child is going to see something that they can eat. And so they don't starve. They can eat. And the parent doesn't have to starve them. The parent can feed them without short order cooking for them.
And I think then that goes like into the idea where it saves you from this short order cook situation. And I think most parents, when you hear that, you go, fine. So like if I give bread at every meal, all he's going to eat is bread, right? Like that's the answer that you would generally get. But I think that the idea is that those meals are still counting as what we talk about a lot, like exposures. And, it may not seem like it that day or even that week, but those continued exposures to different and varied foods kind of accumulate and create a familiarity and a comfort level that eventually translates to trying and often even enjoying a wider variety of foods. It's just being patient.
You're exactly right. And then there's also the principle of sensory specific satiety, which applies to both children and adults. And what it means is that we tire of even our favorite foods and seek alternatives. So kids tire of their favorite foods. Yes, he's going to eat only bread for a week or 2 weeks or even longer. But eventually he's going to get tired of bread and start looking around and seeing what else is available and eating something different.
I think every parent with a Costco membership knows exactly what you're talking about because I feel like my kids love something and I go out and I buy like 100 of them. And then I'm left with like 85 of them when they've decided they're tired of it. And it's like, now what are we going to do with this?
And it's never gradual, is it, Kristen?
No.
I mean, it's night and day. It's like eat cold turkey.
And then we're over it. It's frustrating. So one thing I definitely want to make sure we include in this conversation is family meals. I'm, obsessed with family meals might be an understatement. But just because I feel like there's so many benefits of the family meal that I just love to promote and celebrate it. But I also love the way that the division of responsibility and your approach to feeding children fits in to make the family meal such a more joyous and peaceful, pleasant experience for families. So can you talk a little bit about the benefit of family meals as you see it and how this division of responsibility can be helpful within that context?
Well, before we started recording, I told you that my motive for today, my underlying thing that I wanted to get across to parents is that not to freak them out about doing their feeding jobs and not to make them feel like getting a meal on the table is one more thing they're failing at. That parents always have their bags packed for a guilt trip, and I don't want to contribute to that because it's not helpful and it's not necessary. Parents want to have family meals. They know meals are important. They don't need to be motivated to have meals. And so really the question becomes, how can we think about meals so they are going to be achievable enough and rewarding enough that we're going to be able to have them. That, we can have meals and we keep on having meals. I mean, and that's 18 years of meals. I mean, that's no small item.
Yeah.
It kind of boggles the mind when you think about it, doesn't it? Although I haven't had kids in the house now for about 30 years and I'm still eating meals. So what can I say?
Right.
It's a good idea.
But so can you talk a little bit though about, because we have talked a lot about the benefits, because I agree, I think people want to do it and they see that they are beneficial. I think when you really do the research, sometimes the benefits are even more than you realized, because I thought, wow, this is really astounding. They're more far reaching, but I think at the same time, society doesn't really privilege the family meal right now in terms of people being overscheduled, people are in various groups and activities and things like that. And then the idea that if we're preparing separate meals, sometimes it's more pleasant or easy for, kids to eat at one time and parents to eat at another time. So there are a lot of things that can work against it and make it so that it just doesn't happen on a regular basis or maybe even at all in some families. So what I love is that I feel that helping people to understand the benefits to maybe help them decide that it is important to prioritize this, but also then what are the strategies? Because I mean, a stressful family meal doesn't really carry those benefits that we're talking about. And so that's where I love to see things like structure and feeding and this division of responsibility are really the tools that can help to make it a more peaceful, pleasant experience for everyone.
Right. And, pleasant family meals are really nuanced. I said a minute ago that those Minnesota parents said that one of the things that got in the way of their family meals was a picky kid. And that goes to parents' attitude, the attitude that the child should eat everything, some of everything that's on the table. So, and the way to address that is to adjust the parents' expectations about the child's eating. And in fact, a lot of the nuances go in that direction. Parents complain that their child won't stay at the table, that 5 minutes and they want to be gone. Well, if it's a toddler, then 5 minutes is a pretty good duration. A hungry toddler will come to the table and they'll be businesslike and they'll eat until they're full, and then before long they're ready to go. And if you don't want them to spoil the meal for everybody, you better let them go, because after that they're going to horse around and do stuff that irritates the parents, and so you let them go, and then you teach them to play quietly so the rest of the people at the table can enjoy their meal. And so those are the the couple of things that go on that parents understanding normal child eating behavior is one of the things that really supports parents in being able to have family meals.
Yeah, at each sort of developmental stage, like understanding, like you had talked about, like picky eating is very developmentally normal for a toddler.
Exactly.
And maybe sometimes eating I have a 13-year-old son that has had a very large growth spurt in the last year. And I will say, even as someone, that knows better to comment or be hands off, I mean, those kids can put away a lot of food, like what can seemingly seem alarming. And on the flip side, you can have a school-age kid when maybe they're not growing very quickly, where they can eat an alarmingly small amount of food for a lot of meals. I know it. But what I love is the division of responsibility.
Like they can live on air.
They can. I think they do sometimes. But I felt like the division of responsibility really is what frees you from those mealtime battles, because when you realize, my job is to just, do the what are we going to eat, where are we going to eat, when are we going to eat, and then that's it. Because the battles generally come where you try to when people are stepping on each other's toes, as I say, where, the child's trying to decide where and what we're going to eat or when we're going to eat. And you're trying to control how much and of what they're going to eat. So when you just hands off, then you can just say, when to me, it was the mindset shift. Like the meal is intended for me for you to know that there's food available at you're in a food secure place and it's here. You have plenty of food to grow as you need.
Very good point.
But the real, where I'm coming, my motivation for being here is really this, to enjoy some time with you.
Yep, exactly. And therein lies the benefit of the family meal, is the child's having reliable access to the parent where they can get the parent's undivided attention. And it is, something that the family can count on, that there are these times that they're going to come together in a positive way. And, everything just flows from that.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Ellyn. This has been absolutely wonderful. I very much enjoyed having you here. So for anybody that's interested in learning more, this resonated. They said, I think this is exactly what my family needs. What resources do you suggest for them?
Well, I would
besides my podcast.
In addition to your podcast, that's right. To do a search on the web for Ellyn Satter and see what comes up. And it's likely to take you to the Ellyn Satter Institute. It's likely to take you to my books. It's the ESI has a website that just has oodles of resources in it. I think doing a quick and dirty search is just going to get the job done.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Feeding the Family. If you're enjoying these episodes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss one, and we'll see you next week.